Good to see you again. As you'll know by now, I'm Chris Davis, and this is Just Political Reality, your weekly dose of unbridled truth in a sea of lies. Let's get the begging bowl stuff out of the way nice and early as usual. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe to the channel, share the video, and click like. Don't worry, I'll remind you again at the end. We'll kick off today's show, which has an overarching theme of It's the Economy, Stupid, with an overview from the three key areas of tax and spend that the government must get hold of in very short order. After presenting my alternative view of the so-called established wisdom of the machinery of government, we end the show with an interview with Mike Hughes, a former small business owner who now manages his personal fund, to discuss his thoughts on the key areas the government should focus on to improve the flow of funds to the Exchequer and promote innovation and entrepreneurship. Let's get into it. The Conservative and Unionist Party's reputation for sound economic management is in tatters. With 2/3 of his own MPs that are not part of the government payroll voting no confidence in Boris Johnson last Monday, he has now used up 8.5 of his 9 lives. The theme for today's show is It's the Economy, Stupid. I'll be attempting to plot an economic course for the government that will not only resonate with Conservative principles, but also give the Conservative and Unionist Party a chance of achieving what is looking increasingly unlikely: a shot at winning the next general election. We're in the midst of a cost of living crisis that the Office for Budget Responsibility, the Bank of England, and the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development all believe will last until at least December 2023, with the most generous estimates being that inflation will still be at or above 4% at that time. Allowing the Bank of England to rack up 450 billion of quantitative easing during the pandemic was at least twice as much as was needed, and has helped to fuel inflation due to a surplus of money in the system. In this edition of the show, I'll be proposing tax cuts to mitigate the cost of living crisis and begin to row back from the highest tax burden in over 70 years. There are many areas where the government needs to look seriously at its direction of travel, not least net zero and immigration. But today's show attempts to present a conservative alternative to the current unconservative thinking around 3 key areas. Taxation. I'll examine those areas of both personal and corporate taxation where the government's muddled and reactive policies, in the absence of a clear strategy, have delivered a cumbersome and excessive tax burden for all that disincentivises innovation. Zero-based budgeting for all government departments. Beginning with the 2023-24 fiscal year, it is time the government stopped Secretaries of State and the Civil Service simply spending this year's budget and expecting that number to be the start point for next year. Starting with diversity consultants, rainbow-coloured crossings and the next track and trace fiasco, it is time to look at what is needed rather than what will simply keep the left in check. Moratorium on all capital projects. As well as the white elephant money guzzler that is HS2, the assumption that because this left of centre government has approved something that has not yet meaningfully got going and offers no cost benefit to the taxpayer should continue must be rebutted. What you will hear today is not a silver bullet to fix all of the unconservative nonsense that successive so-called conservative governments have pursued in the name of policy since 2010, during which time the national debt has doubled, more than actually, to over £2.3 trillion, with debt servicing costs this year alone at 83 billion and rising. It is, however, a starting point to pivot the Conservative Party back towards centre-right, fiscally responsible routes that should be followed by a more holistic, strategic review to provide a framework for taxation and spending, not just for this Parliament, but for the next 10 years. If we do nothing, the national debt will continue to rise, our population will keep ageing, and marginal rates of taxation will make the 1970s look like a low-tax economy. It is literally now or never. Income tax equates to around 30% of all taxation raised by the Treasury. In April, the Chancellor chose to freeze personal allowances. That's the amount of money each of us earn before being taxed. As inflation has not been frozen, in real terms, we're all worse off. I advocate the unfreezing of personal allowances and an immediate reduction in the standard rate of income tax of a penny in the pound. National insurance raises around 19% of all tax revenues. It's historically been used to fund state pensions and other specific events-based situations such as job seekers allowance, maternity allowance and bereavement support. From the 1st of April, in breach of the Conservative Party manifesto of 2019, the government increased national insurance by 1.25% on the grounds that it needed to fund additional spending on the NHS to try and catch up on the operations backlog, and if there was any money left over, unlikely as that may seem, to fund social care. Given the increased receipts in VAT alone as a result of the huge hike in fuel prices, this increase is no longer necessary. It never was, and it should be reversed immediately. VAT produces around 18% of all tax revenue. If ever a tax was misnomered, it's value-added tax. It is in fact a purchase tax. It applies to pretty much everything, and it is the largest of the stealth taxes by quite some distance. Leaving the EU means we have absolute discretion over what items we exempt from VAT. Scrapping VAT on domestic energy bills was a key Brexit commitment. It would save around £100 on current bills and should be applied immediately. The benefits would only increase as bills increase, so it's a win-win. Fuel duty accounts for around 5% of all government tax receipts. The temporary 5p a litre cut announced in this year's budget was very quickly absorbed as rising oil prices, and particularly the cost of refining the oil, as we no longer do most of that in the UK, has seen petrol and diesel prices head towards £2 a litre. Fuel duty still amounts to 53 pence in every litre purchased. Add to that value-added tax, and if unleaded and diesel prices do hit £2 a litre, over 40% of the cost of each litre will still be going to the Treasury. Until the wholesale price of oil reduces to a sensible level, whereby the price at the pump begins to come down meaningfully, the government should reduce fuel duty to 30 pence per litre and reduce VAT to 5%. Doing so would bring the price of a litre down today to under £1.50. The renewables levy on electricity bills raises a relatively modest £9 billion. However, whilst that may seem modest, it's actually around £325 per household. With energy bills continuing to soar and the renewable energy sector maturing, it is increasingly difficult to argue for public funding without guaranteed increases in energy capacity, which the renewable sector just cannot give. Nor are they offering reduced energy bills in the short term. The logical thing to do is to scrap the renewables levy. This would command widespread public support and save an appreciable amount on utility bills. Turning to business taxes, corporation tax generates around 5% of all taxation. Since 2010, the government has successively reduced corporation tax from 26% down to 19%. It was ultimately planned to fall to around 17%. However, in 2021, the Chancellor proposed that corporation tax would in fact increase from its current level back up to 26%. This is a jobs tax and will not incentivise businesses to employ people. Now, unemployment at the moment is relatively low, but it is expected to begin to increase as the year goes on. Ireland has a corporation tax of 15%. The United Kingdom should mirror it. It will mean more taxes to the Treasury, as there will be less tax mitigation, and will also create more employment. A win-win. Business rates produce around 4.5% of all tax raised by the Treasury. They are levied based on the rateable value of non-domestic property and are effectively a council tax for business. Specifically in relation to retail, which I think we're all aware from the high street is having a shocking time, it makes sense for the government to act here. And to reverse the terminal decline of retail on the high street, my proposal is that the government should waive business rates for all businesses employing less than 10 employees until at least 2024, during which time it should undertake a root and branch review of the whole business rates system. Finally, North Sea oil and gas. This produces a relatively modest 1% of all government tax receipts. Companies operating in the North Sea pay 3 separate profit-based taxes on oil and gas production: corporation tax, petroleum revenue tax, and a supplementary charge. They effectively pay twice the amount of corporate taxes of the average UK business, near 40% of their profits. Given the crisis in energy security exacerbated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with new drilling licenses already granted and more potentially to come, it is likely that revenue from this form of taxation will increase in the coming years. I do not therefore understand the logic of imposing a windfall tax which will only produce £5.2 billion on oil and gas producers, when due to our legacy flawed energy policy, which was very much imports driven, we now need to secure energy supply by encouraging those same producers who we want to take the money off to invest more in speculative North Sea oil and gas drilling. The tax should be scrapped immediately. Zero-based budgeting does exactly what it says on the tin. It is a mechanism for looking at the beginning of each year at exactly what needs to be spent rather than what we would all like to have spent. There is far too much waste in government. I've already touched earlier in the show on diversity consultants, rainbow coloured crossings, and the track and trace fiasco. It is essential that when the custodian of taxpayers' money, the government uses that money wisely. People are much better at controlling their own money than giving it to the government. The outcomes tend to be better, much more satisfactory, and I don't know about you, but in my experience, my household budgeting is rather better than a government that has a national debt approaching £2.5 trillion. This needs to become the default position for all government departments going forward. The automatic assumption that what was spent last year, plus a markup of 2.5% or 5%, or depending on how left-leaning you are, maybe 20% a year, is just for the birds. We have to get back to making sure that what we spend represents good value for money for the taxpayer. Now, I'm not proposing that we slash government spending to the point where we don't care for people who are in need, that we don't properly fund social care, that we have an NHS that is completely in the hands of the private sector. No such thing. But what we need to decide is, what do we want from the state? What do we want from the government? Do we want the government to provide everything? That's a World Economic Forum mantra. We will have nothing, but we will be happy. No, that's Marxism. I don't support that. I don't think most people in this country do. I genuinely believe that if people are allowed to keep more of their own money, they will spend it wisely. They will put it back into the economy, and through VAT, they will purchase more, which increases tax receipts to the revenue. Every time taxes are cut, the receipts by the Treasury increase. That is simple economics, and that is what needs to happen. Stop spending our money on vanity projects. Stop spending our money automatically each year more and more. Look at value. It's not that hard, but it's something that this government and all governments like it often eschew in favour of more of the same. More of the same is what's got us to where we are today. No more. There are two types of government spending: capital and revenue. What is spent by government departments year to year is essentially revenue spending. Capital projects, usually white elephants, are things dreamed up by the government to improve, let's say, infrastructure. So, for example, the chronic underfunding of nuclear power in this country, which has now left us woefully short of reliable energy, is something that should have been addressed over the last 30 years, but governments of both red and blue hue have ignored it. Alternatively, HS2, a vanity project if ever there was one, which is going to end up costing, let's be honest, over £150 billion and will inevitably be late, is an example of government spending out of control. I'm calling for a moratorium on all of these large capital projects, however far down the road they are, with a view to scrapping those that are no longer needed. Now, there will have to be a cost-benefit analysis done here, because some will be so far along that the cost of completion is cheaper than scrapping the project. I know that may sound strange, but them's the rules. But things like HS2 that are still relatively new and barely out of the ground could be stopped, probably should be stopped. What I'm calling for is no more money wasted. It is that simple. The government, in trying to appease increasingly the Labour Party, those on the left, the Green lobby, and all of those bedwetters, has lost control, has lost focus on managing capital expenditure. So major projects that could and arguably should have been completed, like new nuclear, have gone by the wayside in favour of vainglorious projects like HS2. Surely it would make more sense to connect the north, east to west, the north to south. I know not everybody agrees with me on that, and that's fine. But the point is, a sensible conversation needs to be had around what is needed rather than what is wanted. It is imperative when spending taxpayers' money that a cost-benefit analysis is done, that things come in on budget, on time, and achieve the desired result. In any other walk of life in the private sector, people who persistently overspend are late with delivering projects, and those projects don't then deliver value, get fired. Why should it be any different in the public sector, particularly when you're dealing with taxpayers' money? My money, your money, our money. The government exists to serve us, not the other way around. It needs to remember that. My next guest is Mike Hughes. Mike is a fellow, in his case, former small business owner. Mike grew up in Manchester, attending Stretford Grammar School before moving to East Anglia and training as a freight forwarder. He decided on a technical career and joined the RAF in 1980. Having trained as a flight systems technician, he became a junior officer and attended the Royal Military College of Science in Shrivenham. He passed out with an honours degree in aviation electronic systems and left the RAF in 1988, joining BT as an IT security consultant, working in both the commercial and government sectors for security. Mike became an independent consultant in 2007, starting his own business, which he ran successfully through to 2020. Currently, Mike manages his own personal fund and has a broad interest in macroeconomics. Mike, it's a delight to welcome you to the show.
Nice to meet you, Chris.
Mike, you very kindly follow me on Twitter for your sins, for which I can only apologise. We engage semi-regularly on matters economic. And as the theme of this week's show is It's the Economy, Stupid, you very kindly put out a tweet in response to my request for potential interviewees that raised a number of very interesting points, none of which I can find great contention with. We'll run through those initially, and then we'll broaden out the conversation if that's okay. But the first point that you made was about increasing receipts to the Exchequer and stimulating business growth. That's business growth, not a contraction in the economy, which we're currently heading for, by reducing income tax and corporation tax. Now, in my technical head, that's Laffer curve territory. You reduce taxation, you increase Exchequer receipts. Is that broadly where you're coming from?
Absolutely. And also increasing innovation. I mean, if we want to cover small companies, there are headwinds to small companies that are unnecessary. Taxation is only part, and it's more to do with how taxation's executed as well. But yeah, I believe that we need, at this particular time, the economic models have been done before. You can have a low rate of tax and increased returns to the Exchequer. If it's about returns to the Exchequer and not about a political model, then that's what I believe we ought to consider as a nation. We need to consider what those levels should be that support our economy, obviously. But in general, I think that businesses now, small businesses especially, and medium-sized businesses, are going to be facing terrific headwinds because of inflation, because of labour market forces, because of international trade issues. We've got the war in Ukraine. We've got various trade issues bubbling under the surface. We've obviously left the European Union, and we have to rebuild trade links across the world and not just have trade links, but make them of a high capacity. We have to create and establish those. Now, that's not a 5-minute job, and it's not an easy job. No. And we need to encourage businesses to go and do it as a nation, particularly because of our situation.
Well, you don't do that by increasing corporate taxation, having been reducing it since 2010 back up to 25% from 19, do you?
No, and you certainly don't do it by having high energy taxation issues as well, because obviously energy, despite what we would prefer, some people believe in the CO2 hypothesis. I don't, but I can see how they may do. There is actually a debate about that scientifically. However, we shouldn't be using taxation, which I believe we are right now, to support a particular view of that.
Well,
so just taxing energy.
Yeah, you've just picked up there on multiple issues for me. I mean, one of the points in your tweet was about removing the renewables levy on electricity and also rejigging green policy, which, without putting words in your mouth to me, appears to suggest that we need to, at the very least, rethink net zero. Because I agree with you, net zero for me is not a settled issue. Doesn't mean I don't think that there are CO2 issues. There may very well be. But does that mean that we should be scrapping all internal combustion engine, petrol and diesel derived cars by 2030? Absolutely not.
Yeah. And also, if you think of the pollution that will be caused by doing that, the pollution of creating these batteries don't last forever, replacing these batteries. In fact, when you replace a battery in an electric car, you're pretty much replacing the car because it's probably not going to be worth it. I'm not against it. I think, for instance, so I'm not just a reactionary to all this. I think, for instance, in London, it would be lovely to have a lot of electric vehicles wandering around instead of us breathing that stuff. I mean, I love my cars. But I think that we do, we are evolving. We need to get to a point where we take care of people's health better and better over time. And obviously, it would be nice to have no pollution in the centre of London. For me, one of the great injustices of what's happening is that by focusing on net zero and the amount of infrastructure investment and the amount of investment generally, and the disabling effects on the economy and the people, it ignores all of the other pollution aspects that we should be also caring about. We should be caring about pollution discharges into rivers. We should be caring about toxic pollution in rivers or toxic pollution on land. But this one thing that's unproven is taking over all of that. We should be removing plastics from the ocean. We should be doing all that as a worldwide community. We can't destroy the environment. So for me, it's not that I'm against environmentalism. I'm absolutely not. I just actually believe that we're going to waste, in more than one generation, all of our ability to do things through money because of a misplaced idea. And the way we're doing it right now, with this high taxation on energy and a time of all-time energy high prices, is mind-blowing. It shouldn't take months for a Chancellor of the Exchequer to work out this, and a Prime Minister to work out this is what we need to do.
It really shouldn't. I mean, the net zero zealotry I have a real issue with, because no one can actually give an accurate figure for what the cost of moving across to net zero will be. I mean, Philip Hammond suggested back in 2018 that it might be £1 trillion. I think it's probably say it's at least double that figure now. Now, that would be virtually doubling the national debt, by the way, if you don't do something around taxation to fund it. But I think the issue with the whole green policy is that as far as a good chunk of world leaders are concerned, this is a settled issue. It is far from that. The science, as you say, is not settled on this. But
they think they're doing what we want. They think they're saying things that are going to get them votes. That's the only thing I can believe.
Well, I think that's fine. I think if you are on the left of British politics, then I think absolutely you can say this stuff with impunity. And not just British politics, globally. If you look at what's happened, for example, in the Australian elections, where the Liberal Nationals have been defeated by Albanese's Labour Party, and they went big on net zero, but they couldn't go as big as the left do, because the left will always spend more, they'll always promise more, and they'll always ultimately deliver less. But fundamentally, you will not outspend, at least theoretically, the left on things like net zero. And to me, I mean, you touched there on, for example, battery technology. I've seen this week that Skanska have now developed the first dual fuel excavator, which looks at both hydrogen and conventional diesel power, with a view to eventually just converting to hydrogen only. And hydrogen could well be an excellent transition fuel once they harness that technology properly. But all of this focus on batteries, particularly given the fact that we left Afghanistan in, shall we say, undue haste, and left all of the minerals in the ground that we're going to need for these batteries, I find even more galling. One of the other points in your tweet that you touched on was removing the ambiguities around IR35 to encourage small companies and encourage self-employment. I don't think many people know just how many people in this country are employed by SMEs and micro businesses. It's over 10 million people.
And I think it's even more interesting than that. I think if we look at the situation now, obviously the labour force is going through a massive transition. In my case, for instance, I would go to companies for a short time, for a defined period, help them fix some problems, hope to help them fix some problems, and then you'd bugger off and go and do another project somewhere else. Now, that meant that we had flexibility in the workforce. I wasn't drawing any benefits. I had my own company. I didn't need a large company to employ me. I didn't need another pension fund. I didn't need anything. On top of that, they're so concerned about the fact that small companies can declare what's profit, what's salary, and therefore decide national insurance contributions to a degree. You do get an slightly easier ride on national insurance, or you did. That's ridiculous. On every invoice I charged to a company, there was VAT.
Yeah.
Overwhelmed any other tax. So because I worked, instead of working for a company and just paying PAYE, I worked and I paid some PAYE, most of the PAYE. To be honest, if you take it as profit, you have to pay some income on it. It's simple as that.
Yep.
There was a minor difference in national insurance, but I was creating for the government 20% of my entire turnover was in VAT returns.
Yep.
What's the problem? And we've got HMR. We seem to have HMRC seem to be in a world of their own. What they like is to deal with a small company and harass them for years. And this isn't just about money. For people, middle-aged people running a business, if you get attacked by HMRC because you told that you've not been operating in the way you should have done for the past few years, so potentially large bills, that can destroy people's health and psychology. Yeah. And it's a big disincentive. What we need right now, we need more entrepreneurs. We need more people. Yeah. We need everybody to do all of their jobs. We just don't necessarily have organizations that can risk employing everybody to do it. So we should be encouraging people to do it for themselves if they can. Yeah. Some people can't and don't want to, and that's fine.
So to be clear, what we're talking about with IR35, for those that aren't familiar, is the principle that you may have a consultant working for you for a period of time. They may be working largely for you or even solely for you. And the way in which the tax system is now trying to capture them is that the employer has to treat them as PAYE, put them on the books, pay employers' national insurance on them and everything else. Whereas what you're really referring to is from 2020 and before, when you ran your own business, you would be engaged there as a consultant. As you say, you'd pay 20% or you would collect 20% on behalf of the government, in addition to whatever your charges were. So what's the issue? We are actually actively discouraging entrepreneurism and the creation of small business.
So the real problem was that the rules around, it was all about, are you working as if you're an employee or are you working as if you're a consultant?
Yeah.
So there was a lot of people who were turfed out of companies and then rehired back as private hires, if you like. And HMRC didn't like this because then obviously they did pay reduced national insurance. They weren't really operating as a company in their view. Okay. But if a person is going between companies constantly and has never gone back to and doesn't just continually go back to the same company he always worked for,
yeah,
you shouldn't have to be going through in the minutiae of rules to be confident that you're kind of okay-ish and you don't owe some more tax for perpetuity. And we don't even have, people can't even tell you whether you're operating inside or outside. They can have a guess. What you have to do is you take insurance out, just in case HMRC decide, oh, well, you really were working inside IR35. That's not appropriate and it's not necessary at all.
It really isn't. And actually, you made the point earlier on about an arrow visit from the HMRC, where they literally turn up unannounced. And by the way, the HMRC have far more powers in this country than the police. You can't say no to them. If they decide they're coming in, and that's how it works. And there's no ifs, buts, maybes, and definitely there's no about it. But not only can they ruin mental health, they can literally take a business down. In a very short space of time, because if they decide that they're going to go through everything, as they are absolutely entitled to do, that's what the law says, and they can go back from memory 7 years. And when they do this, for a small business that, let's say, employs 5 people, that could tie up management for months. Well, you can't run your business like that.
Yeah. There's a few other issues like that as well, yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that you or I want a tax fraudster's charter. Quite the opposite. No. All we want is a fair shake here.
In fact, my philosophy was I did not want the taxman on my back in the future. And so I would err on the side of caution on every single aspect of tax. And I had no sympathy I had loads of consultants who offshored their accounts,
yes,
or took a company that said they would guarantee that they'd get nearly all of their money, because you knew in the end that many of these schemes, and they were schemes,
yeah,
were defrauding the Exchequer. We all need services, but also at some point they're going to fail. And I had no sympathy for them, to be honest. It was obvious what was going to happen. So I'm talking about straightforward, honest taxation policy, and not having HMRC. If I was Unilever, there would be a completely different approach to my tax affairs. They would ask me. Unilever would send them a report, they'd look at it, they've only got so many people, so they can't really go through it properly, so they negotiate an amount of tax. And many of them pay absolutely minimal amounts of tax.
Pennies on the
You're a
pound.
one-person band, and this is one-man band. I was in real trouble.
Oh, steady on, Mike. Steady on.
A one-person band. They've got you. One of their guys can very quickly go through all of your records, find where you may or may not have complied in some area, and then drag you to court. And as an individual, you can't work at those times because you're tied up with doing all this stuff. You're extremely stressed, and it puts a lot of people off. A lot of people then just say, you know what, I'm just going to take a normal. I can't be bothered with all this. Well, right now, I think we need people to be more adventurous than ever.
Absolutely.
Because I think we're in for some hard times.
Well, look, when you've got an economy where inflation, and I don't buy consumer price index inflation, particularly as it excludes anything in relation to housing. Retail price index builds it back in, it's 11.1%. But you then look at the producer price index, which is currently 17.6%. And that's much nearer. And if you've only got to look at diesel and petrol costs, my calculus is that inflation at the moment is going up around 1.25% a month. So it's about 15%, slightly more than that when you compound annually. That is huge. And how do you begin to mitigate an economy that technically was the fastest growing in the G7 last year? This year is going to be the slowest. Yeah. And technically, we're heading for recession. Now, whether we actually have 2 quarters of negative growth or not, we can all see that things are contracting. Consumer confidence has crashed. But just to pick up on a point you made there about Hughes Security versus Unilever. So as Hughes Security is much easier for the HMRC to come in and make your life hell. Yeah. For Unilever, you're quite right. They don't have the resources to take on a company of that size. And by the way, Unilever is not the only show in town. There are lots of.
No, it's not. And I just put that out thin air. There's nothing against Unilever
No,
whatsoever.
we're not picking on them. Their products are great.
Just picked a large multinational corporation. That's it.
We just don't want to get sued. So in all seriousness, one of the other points of your tweet, was the last point of your tweet, was force HMRC to take the full taxation liability on large companies. And what you're saying here is you want equity in the tax system. So in other words, you're not asking for them to come in and break Unilever's balls any more than they broke yours.
Or Amazon.
But what you're asking for is equity.
Yes.
And that's not an unreasonable request in a tax system for all, is it?
No. I think we've got specific, I think there's a bit of a theme actually to most of the things that I'm thinking about is that we've had, we had the Brexit referendum, we've eventually we managed to get out from the European Union, although in honesty, I can see so many ways in which that could be reversed step by step. But leaving that aside, at this time, we need people in business to be adventurous and make new business relationships and be successful. We've got massive economic turbulence ahead. You look at the price, I said I was a fund manager, I virtually haven't done much in terms of buying in the past 2 years because the P/E ratios are ridiculous.
Yes.
The stock market has been in a complete world of its own. There's no price discovery. You can't find out what's a bargain, what's not a bargain, because everybody's piled into the stock market. Indexes have meant that basically individual stocks have been overinflated in terms of true value. And now we're looking at a time when companies won't be earning anything like what people hoped they would, never mind the 26-to-1 P/E ratios. I mean, so we're looking at some really hard times when I believe there is going to be a severe financial crash. And there's going to be a lot of difficulty as a result of that. And we really need to be getting people to work together. It sounds a bit too hopeful, but we need a more cooperative and friendly approach in the UK to how we reconcile our views and how we move forward. So instead of fighting each other over insulate now, there's a discussion to be had about insulation and how we're going to use that to reach some goals. But we shouldn't be having a situation where it's destroying business. We shouldn't be having a situation where half of our establishment, or a large part of our establishment, not just on all sides of Parliament, are really just waiting for a time to drag the UK back into the EU on whatever terms. Doesn't really matter. We shouldn't be doing that. We should be working now to make the UK successful.
Well, you've just highlighted a few things there. P2E, for the benefit of the tape, is price to earnings ratio for those that are not minded in terms of valuing equities. I think you're quite right about the stock market. I think there's a bubble. I think there are a number of bubbles in the global financial system, and it's not going to take too many moves for it all to unravel 2008 style plus, in my humble view. No. But I think when you start looking at the direction of travel around, for example, Brexit, there's no question. You only have to look at the day that the vote of no confidence was held in Boris Johnson. You had the likes of Andrew Adonis, very open. These guys have been hiding in plain sight for a long time. Alistair Campbell, we know what they want to rejoin.
Yeah, there was one Conservative MP that voted against Boris and made it public on Twitter.
Yep. And
he made it clear in his list. I mean, all of the reasons were all different, but in his list, it was quite strange. One of his main objections was that we shouldn't tamper with the Northern Ireland Protocol. Well,
I think that was
a trade issue. For God's sakes, that's a trade issue, and he was a member of the government. I mean, nobody wants to see a problem in Northern Ireland, but the protocol itself needs to be addressed. So I can't believe that we've still got members of Parliament on the Conservative benches who basically don't want the UK to be outside of the European Union.
Well, I think the MP in question was Jesse Norman, who was a Boris loyalist. And the whole issue, this thing around the Northern Ireland Protocol, let's go there briefly. I'm no Arlene Foster, but I understand enough of it to know that the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is a sovereign territory. I don't know of any other state in the world that would sign up to allow another unelected bureaucratic body to dictate to one part of its United States, United Kingdom, in our case, that they have to take rules from the European Union, but they have to abide by them, but they have no say over them. And if you look at what's happened in terms of GBNI trade, which is not, as Fraser Nelson referred to it in The Spectator, as exports, because it's all part of the United Kingdom. And that really infuriated us, you can probably tell. But what's happened is that where Northern Ireland companies have not been able to get goods from GB, they're going to the Republic of Ireland, much to the glee of the European Union.
And this is what's confusing me with Boris's approach. I mean, I think Boris is a clever guy, I'll be honest with you. I think most of the political pundits, we won't call them political pundits and politicians, are they're not the brightest. They'll say a view, a desired outcome, but they'll have no strategy to get there.
Yes.
So agreed. I believe that Boris is a clever guy, and I think he knows that he wants to pick his time when this happens, so that there's not massive or unfortunate coincidence of trade issues at the same time when caused by the NIP protocol at a time when he's not ready to deal with it. Because if for instance, if this had happened immediately the day after we'd left the European Union, so obviously trade was downscaled with what was our largest trading partner. Mm-hmm. There was no doubt about that. We accepted that. If you didn't accept that, then you know that's craziness. So we needed to replace those trade capacities with either the European Union or the rest of the world. Now that takes time, and you can't completely disrupt everything the day after you've left. And that's because not only was it trade, it was a political time bomb. People who never wanted to leave would have been on the streets. Mm-hmm. People who did vote to leave would have been worried because of trade disruption. So I think he's a smart guy. But I think the interesting thing with Boris, I think he's changed a bit, because obviously COVID affects people in different ways. And I definitely believe it affected Boris. I think he was affected after the first time when he refused to lead the party, when he had his spat with Govt. I think that he wasn't the same after that. He's not as courageous as he was, and he's not as young as he was.
No,
I believe but I still think he's got a lot of possibilities. But he's going to have to grow a pair.
I mean,
these issues are building now to the point where his desire or reluctance to grasp some of these issues is creating division in society. It's raising the hopes of rejoiners, and it's dashing the hopes of people who want to see the UK do well outside of the European Union. And this is creating trade and personal stress. And I think that we're losing the plot, Lawrence.
I think I'm probably slightly less Boris enthusiastic than you are, but I'm happy to share with you why. Given, Boris won 2 elections as London mayor in what is, there's no question about it, London is now absolutely a Labour city, and I can't see that changing any more than I could see Labour losing Scotland to the SNP. So I'm probably wrong, but certainly at the moment, London is absolutely a Labour city, and Boris won 2 successful mayoral elections. He did well. In terms of the Brexit position, the old 2 envelopes in the pocket, Boris is an opportunist. And I think Boris realised that heading up the Leave campaign, one, it was probably a bit of a kick in the eye to David Cameron, and ultimately it was a successful kick in the eye to David Cameron. And 2, I think Boris, where I agree with you, he's clever, is he has the capacity to tap into the zeitgeist of the day. And I think there was probably enough in it for him to think, even if I lose this, it's not going to do me any harm profile-wise. And then in terms of the 2019 election, Boris came in as a white knight and saved the day, won the election, had universal appeal, quote unquote. But I think that the biggest thing, and this is why I'm so surprised that people are so up in arms. I don't mean the mainstream media, because as we all know, there is inherent bias there. But the reason I find it quite hard to believe that people are so up in arms now about Boris is the 160,000 Conservative members that voted in the Boris versus Jeremy Hunt runoff in 2019 knew exactly what they were voting for. Boris has a, shall we say, cosy relationship with the truth. He cuddles it when it suits him and he spurns it when it suits him, a bit like
politicians. That's politicians.
And absolutely. And I think...
Look at Starmer, for God's sake, with his visit to Durham. I mean, it's pathetic.
Keir Starmer's visit to Durham, standing as the great sort of pious, kneeling in front of the United Kingdom flag.
That's the saddest for me.
But look, he's mendacious, and he's a technocrat.
I think there's a couple of issues here. So one of the things is, I like people, right? Generally, I'm interested in people. Boris is an interesting guy, and he's quite an intellectual. He gets a lot of stick for being a bit. People think he's dim. He's absolutely not dim. One of the things I would expect with somebody like Boris. Boris came from the private education, a very good education, and he had a very good education at university.
Yep.
And he did classics. And one of the things that those people do is they will write both sides of the debate. Why? Because it provokes your thought yourself. And if you can't write the pros and cons against on each side yourself, that means you just don't know what's going on.
I agree.
That's why he had 2 views. If you look at any of his speeches that people pillar him for, and then you look at the context in which it was done, we're being ridiculous. The media are being absolutely ridiculous about some of this stuff. I don't think he's everything. I don't think he's fantastic in some respects. I think that, I don't know what his position in the party is. I never really understood why he's being reticent to do some of these things, illegal migration, etc. Because this has been a rolling story now. And unless things are dealt with, there's no way we're going to be able to stay outside. We look at parties like, I won't go into the old parties because it'll upset everybody, but we look at most of the other parties. No party seems to have any way to get a mandate. So what that means, there's going to be a grouping together, a coalition of parties, which is only going to work one way.
Keep the Tories out.
If you look at the landscape, that's only going to work one way. We need to get some action together. We need people to be able to see what Brexit means to the UK, why it's good, what things it doesn't give us, and we lose because we've left. But we need people now to see the benefits, and
Mike,
you can do that.
I think what we're currently heading for. You asked what the view is in the party, and I think it's quite clear where it is in the parliamentary party. When you get 148 people vote against you out of 359, and 140 of the 211 that voted with you are on the government payroll, it basically means that 2/3 of the people that are not on the government payroll don't agree with him. Now, to my mind, the direction of travel that the party needs to go in, and Boris needs to take it in, it has to tack back to conservative principles. And that begins with, and it's the whole theme of the show, it's the economy stupid. So it has to mean lower taxation. It has to mean more incentives for innovation. It has to be about more people keeping more of their money in their pocket. And you're not going to tackle inflation now by chasing interest rates higher and higher. I don't mean that interest rates should ever been at 2%, never mind where they went to in the end of 0.1%. And look, inflation at 2% is relatively anodyne. You do need a little bit of inflation, I accept that. But where it is now, it is out of control. It will come back down. But simple things like, why is petrol and diesel going through the roof? Because we don't refine anything here anymore. It's largely done in Russia. Oops, problem. You've had to go and find somewhere else to do it. Guess what? They're going to charge you a lot more money for it. Energy security. We have plenty of gas, plenty of oil in the North Sea. Yes, we have the potential for fracking, which is a whole other issue. But for the last 40 years, nuclear power in this country has been largely ignored. And it shouldn't have been. In France, 78% nuclear. The average bill is going up 4 or 5%. In the UK, 17% nuclear and dropping, and the average bill has already gone up 54%. It's going up another 50% in October. These are not difficult things, are they?
This hints at what I think. I think we need a kind of a national debate about this stuff, because the reason is, I hear what you're saying about nuclear. Right now, it's very tempting, but we're also throwing away some of our memories of what that journey was like. With Sellafield being nuclear power stations taking decades to dismantle. The storage of the spent uranium or spent radioactive fuels, the potential long-term impact on the environment.
And you're looking at.
I'm not against it. I just think that I think that where we parked this when it before the energy crisis, where this was parked was, we're not going to go too heavily down the nuclear route. Germany obviously had decided completely against nuclear for their reasons. And then when the energy crisis came, we said, you know what, well, crikey, let's get some nuclear. Now, it's not, we need to have that proper discussion and debate and make proper strategic decision. How we're going to go through this. This nonsense about we've got loads of these wind turbines here off the coast. Not working when it's not windy, no real guarantee of energy supply, a green levy to pay for more of these things. We've got gas. We need to make a proper decision about the future, how we want to do things, and then plan a proper way to get there. We've had ridiculous deals that involve the Chinese with Hinkley Point, etc., etc. We just need a proper national strategy. And as far as I'm concerned, we don't really seem to have one. And the people are not engaged in these discussions. All we've got is activism on one side or the other. And I'm open to discussion on any of those subjects as to what the correct route is. But I don't believe we have a route. I think what we have is kind of a hit and hope approach to the future, where we make it intolerable for people. Right now, the way I see this energy crisis, the way it's being deployed in many countries, you mentioned the WF, but it seems to me the way this is being deployed is basically an assault, a direct assault on the average person using fossil fuels. We do not have the alternatives in place. Air-sourced heat pumps, massive issues with them, massive cost.
Absolutely.
Inefficient, you need loads of electricity to run them. So the whole debate, as far as I'm concerned, is totally immature, and it's in every single area. And one of the things that I think that the government need to do is bring people together through these discussions. They seem to be just living in isolation in Westminster. All of them are doing this, having banter, but actually no clear strategy.
And isn't it interesting how many other countries in the world that are so-called Western liberal democracies are doing exactly the same thing? Just looking at how we begin to redraw the lines here, because you have to start with a line in the sand. In my mind, I think government departments need to go back to zero-based budgeting. So in other words, just because we've always done X doesn't mean that next year we need to do X plus 2.5% more in terms of cost. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think there needs to be a moratorium on all capital projects, everything from the very high profile HS2 downwards, that takes a look at where is the value and what is the cost benefit analysis on these. How do you stand on those two issues?
I agree with the basic point that we need to look at how we're the size of the state and what is the purpose of the state. That's basically, I think, what you said.
Yes, it is essentially, yeah.
But also massive capital projects. I mean, HS2. I have, over a number of years now, been concerned, we'll put it that way, and been proven right about the way the budget would, the direction of the budget, and to some extent how large the budget would become. Mm. But I'm also concerned on a usage basis. If we're saying right now, and we seem to be saying, or a large part of the communication is that people may not be moving around so much, because why move people around if you can work from home, etc. There's that side of the discussion. I'm not supporting it, but that's one side.
Yep.
So why then are you creating extremely high cost, the highest cost high-speed rail in the world, to my knowledge, that's going to save about an hour, 40 minutes to an hour, depending on how many times it stops, on a journey from Manchester to London.
Yeah.
Why? Who is going to be using this? If we look at the train service right now, I'll give you a classic example. How much is it? I did one contract for DWP in Blackpool. I live in East Anglia. I had to get there each week. Stayed there all week, came back at weekend. How much do you reckon a standard, I'll have to approximate now because I haven't checked but I'll be within 10%. A standard class ticket to go from Ipswich to Blackpool. How much do you reckon that would cost? Through not a peak time ticket, a standard class ticket to travel any time. Yeah, you do have to be able to travel any time to achieve
this is a standard open return?
Yes.
Okay, my guess would be at least £280.
Try over 400.
I mean, well, very interesting.
And when you go on that trip, it's not full of people. If I go to London tomorrow, a standard ticket, I think, is about, well, it ranges about 80, 90 quid, I think, for a return, open return. If you go first class, obviously a lot more. If I go on that train, any other than peak times, it's absolutely empty.
Yeah.
So now we're going to create a massively high-speed rail link that's going to be empty for most of the day, which is obviously going to be more expensive than a normal, when all of the rest of rail links are suffering. And actually, we're not encouraging people to use the trains at all.
Well, Mike, to give you and this is this week, I had two clients, senior people, come down this week from Durham and Darlington, respectively, for meetings in the City of London. They had a return, same day return, admittedly open return. They had a notional for 4:30, but it was an open return.
Yeah.
And admittedly, they went first class because they fancied some breakfast. That was over £500 each on what is essentially now a nationalised railway. Now, just flipping back to HS2, I had folks, when I mentioned, HS2 being, shall we say, subject to scrutiny, saying, well, of course, the rolling stock between London and Manchester is old and out of date, and you have to stand, and there's not enough trains and everything else. Well, hold on a second. There are two stories about HS2 that really concern me. One is the price goes one way and it doesn't go down. And people can talk about, well, the original cost in 2009, and then when you factor in inflation, everything else is broadly value for money. Well, I'm not convinced about that, but maybe I'll let that go. But my big issue with HS2, and this is a real life situation right now, is that in their infinite wisdom, HS2's management team rejected an offer from the principal contractor, which is Balfour Beatty Vancy, around the subject of fixed prices for materials. And specifically, when you're building a rail line, one of your biggest costs is cement. Pouring cement at the moment typically is around £95 per cubic metre. Because they rejected the fixed price, they're being charged £120 per cubic metre. Now, when I say they, that's you and me. That's every taxpayer in the country. Yeah. They are being overcharged to almost 28%. Now, what that does is two things. One, it pushes up further the cost of HS2. Two, it also means that every time they pour concrete, no one else in the country for a significant pour can get any, because everybody's going to divert their resources to HS2. Why? Absolutely. Because they're paying the highest dollar. Yeah. Madness. And it fuels inflation.
Yeah, yeah. And I just think, if you look at the rail system, there are so many ways that system can be improved. Mm. And it all needs improving. Whereas we're going to focus all this again. this massive multi-generational commitment to one tiny thing, one aspect, when everything needs to be considered. So it's happening with energy and it's happening with transport. We need we don't just need better railings, we need a better model for getting people to use it through the day. I mean, to me, it's ridiculous that those trains are traveling mostly through the day with nobody on them.
It's absurd. And then to try and charge you £400 for the privilege of basically being the only passenger.
Remember, Blackpool was a working class holiday destination. Not that I'd want to go there now. Oh, it's great. Blackpool's great.
Oh, I was going to say steady on.
I remember there was Jeremy Clarkson did one Top Gear where they bought a car and sold it rather than buy a train ticket because it was cheaper. And I think if you think, I was doing this each week. Now, yes, I could buy an advance ticket. We know about that. But you can't always get them. And why should it be that the standard rate for a journey across the UK, which is not the biggest country in the world, can be £400? Because this has a knock-on effect to people's wages, contractors, everybody. This is a sunk cost to the UK. And I think we've got to get these costs down, and we've got to make our services utilised and stop. If you think about this, why would people keep saying, oh, China's got a high-speed rail link, France has got a high-speed rail link? I've got news for you, mate. They're bigger countries. They have bigger distances between endpoints.
Well, if you look at France alone as a micro issue, right? The whole idea of the high-speed rail link in France was that more of France's GDP would be generated from outside of Paris. It's actually done the opposite.
Wow, I didn't know that.
More people can get more quickly into Paris, and so forth. They commute and they work there. Mike, it's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you. I've really
we never got to tax much, did we, in the end?
Well, I'll tell you what, if you're up for it, I definitely am. This will be a running theme over the next couple of years in advance of the election. And I would love to have you back on to talk some more about this, because I think it's really important that people who are actually living the real life on the ground in the British economy come on this show and give people the benefit of their wisdom. As a former small business owner, as an active now fund manager for your own fund, I think it's really important that you're at the cutting edge of this. You see the practical effects of government policy. And I think it's important that you get the opportunity and the platform to do this. So I can promise the viewers and yourself that this will not be your last incursion into just political reality. Mike Hughes, thank you so much for joining me today. For those that don't know Mike, you'll see when I put the show out on Tuesday, his Twitter feed, and I highly recommend that you follow him because he does talk a lot of common sense. We may not agree on absolutely everything, and that's how it should be, because we don't do echo chambers here. But I've thoroughly enjoyed having you on, Mike, and it will not be the last time, rest assured. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks for your time.
It's a pleasure. Cheers.
Cheerio.
Thanks for watching the show, and I hope you enjoyed it. It's time for that begging bowl again, I'm afraid. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to the channel, share the video, and click like. It will make the algorithm folks very happy. On next week's show, I'll be delving into the murky waters of globalism and looking at how compatible the globalist agenda is with nation-state democracy. We'll run the rule over the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations. My panel of guests are scheduled to include Michael Curzon, columnist for the Daily Express and the editor of Bournebrook magazine, and Robert Olds, director of the Eurosceptic think tank, the Bruce Group. Have a great week, and remember, say what you see whilst you're still free. All the best.